Hey Eden growers, Crew More Fury here. Today I want to talk about deep watering and shallow watering, when and why and where we do them. I also like to mention that I'm going to talk about it from the vantage point of someone who may be going through a drought where rain isn't giving them sufficient moisture, rain maybe isn't consistent in the forecast, and it's not enough to bank the moisture down into the bottom layers of your soil, but spring has sprung, and even though that's the case, we still got to get our plant starts in the ground, we still got to get our seeding done, we still got to do all those things we do to get the garden going. But in any event, I'd like to talk about this three-way tester that I use. Very inexpensive tool. It's about 7 or 8 inches long worth of probe. Some of them are a little longer, some of them are a little bit shorter, but I like to use this one because it gets down into the soil deep enough for me to say, hey, do I have moisture where I want my roots to be? Periods of drought, we'd love our roots to be way down deep, 8 inches or so, 6 to 8 inches down below the top covering, so that they're in that layer of soil that is definitely holding on to moisture. And if you're putting it in, it's going down and it's going out, and it's going in and out of the plant. And in many cases, if the sun is present more than there's moisture present, the topsoils will dry out. But down below, we can usually count on there being still some residual moisture down there, banked below the garden, hanging out, waiting for a plant to approach it and say, hey, this is the place I'd like to sink my roots. The only way for me to test that accurately is to occasionally dig down and see how deep my roots are growing, occasionally pulling up plants after they've terminated to see how deep those roots prefer to grow, and then forming associations between each plant. Some grow deep, some grow wide, they all have their own personal set of rules. And what I have found is that when we put the nutrient cycle in place and we give the plants an opportunity to either grow shallow or grow deep, in most cases they'll take the opportunity to do both. And we like full, wide, deep sets of roots around our plants. It helps to balance them and buoy them against winds and changing soil conditions better than something that might be narrow and skinny but just shooting one taproot straight into the ground. I find more often than not a single taproot can be easily pulled straight up out of especially our Eden beds, and that's not something that we want. So in this particular discussion, I'd like to mention it is important to start out by giving your seeds or giving your plant sets moisture right at their existing roots. If you drop a seed in the ground, you need to keep the moisture pretty close to that seed. If you were to deep water that seed, you run the risk of floating the seed out of the soil. You run the risk of the soil staying too wet if it's not the draining type. You could run the risk of, well, many good things as well as bad things. But in particular, I want to hit on only the bad things. In a couple of days, if the sun is baking and you deep watered seeds, a couple of days, there's no more moisture at the seed. So this is why we practice shallow watering. And by shallow watering, I mean we want to make sure that there's water consistently in play in the top 2 or 3 inches of soil. That way those seeds can establish themselves. And then we want to encourage them to grow deeper. And down below me, I'm going to pan down and you'll be able to see a pretty young stand of basil that was direct sown. We didn't do anything special, we just kind of scraped the soil apart. I think I made a video about this previously. We dropped some seeds in place and most all of them came up. There's a couple that didn't, but pretty much all of them did. So I'm going to check the moisture from seed until this point at or around 2 inches depth. So this much of the probe will be inserted into the soil at the plant, at the base of the plant, somewhere near it, within 4 to 6 inches of its center is a good place to drop it in. You won't be disturbing the seed's growth. And you want to check there. And if it shows in the good range on this tester, the scale, which is green, indicates we're in the good range. We don't want to water past that point. We do want to come back the very next day and check to see whether or not that moisture is gone. Is it still in play? We don't know. I don't know. I don't know your garden. I only know the characteristics of my garden. But when I match that with this instrument right here, after a few tests you begin to understand what does this mean when it's in the moist range, what does this mean when it's in the dry range, and what does this mean when it's in, soaking wet range. So moist, soaking wet, and dry, each are going to have a different impact on your plant. Too moist and your roots are going to struggle because it's very difficult for them to be oxygenated when it's full of water. So that interrupts certain cycles and it can blush out seedlings. You'll start to get blushing in your seed, in your green leafy structures where the chlorophyll has been displaced by just clear water, and it's kind of suffocating, so it can't reproduce the respiration forces it needs in order to utilize the sun and the soil and the moisture to bring those nutrients up in and out of the phloem and the xylem and out to the leaf structure through the veins, so it'll begin to struggle. If that's the case and you notice that, always test the soil moisture when you recognize you have a plant that seems to be exhibiting signs of moisture stress. It's not just good practice, but it's healthy practice. So once these guys grow to the size they are now, I start to consider that the roots need to grow deeper because I'm anticipating a long, hot, dry summer. So if I don't encourage the roots to grow deeper, they're going to hang out up here in the top soil where it's really, really rich and they don't have to go down, and then wind is going to come along and blow them over. It's happened. I have to prepare for that. I have to make sure that that doesn't happen, and the best way to make sure that that doesn't happen is to allow those roots to dry out a little bit. The plant may be feeling a little bit of dry out stress, and then follow that with a deep watering. I'll insert this tester all the way into about here in the soil. My beds are deep. The top of my bed is 12 inches and the bottom of my bed is closer to 2 feet. So it's not just good opportunity, it's good habit. Drop the probe in all the way, inspect the reading. When you see the reading, if the reading is in good, you're good. I do like to, for the purpose of certain areas in my garden, to bank a little bit more or a little bit less. If I'm growing watermelons, I prefer to bank a little more. If I'm growing something like garlic, where they don't really want to be saturated, they'll actually show signs of moisture stress rather quickly if they're saturated for too long. So in that case, I might put the garlic in an area that I know allows moisture to strain out of the soil faster and more efficiently, or maybe it might be in a little bit more sun. That gives me that extra effect. So there you have it. So once I see a plant is large enough to develop deep roots, if it's 2 inches tall, there's a good chance it has 2-inch deep roots. It could be deeper, it could be less if it's been stunted. But once I see my plants are about 4 inches, I want them to go for it. So I immediately give them a couple of days off, allow the soil to get just a little bit dry, because I want to put them on a cycle of my own design. And we are talking about during drought times. So once that happens, I can go ahead and I can plunge this into the soil really, really deep and water it away from the plant. If you have more than one plant that are close together, you're going to water more than one plant at the same time. It's the soil we're banking moisture to, not the plant. So once this particular meter shows it's in the good range, around the middle or just off of red, which is dry, I'll stop. I'll give those plants another day, and I might come out and just make a quick test, do a quick reference test the next day to see, did I immediately go into the dry range or am I holding? If I'm holding, I'm happy. I'll come back the next day and check again. I want that moisture to be down in the bottom of the soil. I want the plant's roots to sense that it is down there. It is just simple hydrogen and oxygen, and there will be some off-gassing of those, and it'll be permeating through the soil upwards, and that's going to send signals to the root structures and the biome to encourage that root to grow deeper into the ground so that it can get better access, full-time access, especially when the plant understands that the soils are drying on top but moist on the bottom. That's a great time. That's why we want to cycle between dry and wet. Or we want to cycle between, I should say, moist and dry. We don't want to stay wet for very long. So when it comes to plants' roots, wet's not great, dry's not great, but they can handle a little bit of dry as long as they know the following day or the following hour they're going to get water put back into that soil so they can return to their usual growing habits. If you fail to recognize that they get established into these growing habits, it will become more difficult to bring your plants through the different stages of development. So each stage tells us something different, but it's really important to give the roots what they need. Another real important reason to moisturize the soil like this in cycles is because you're not just feeding the plants nutrients, you're also feeding the bacterium that's around. You're also trying to keep them more vital, more viable, more actively engaged. The fungi as well, they appreciate a bit of drenching, they appreciate the cycling. Much of what they do is based on those cycles, based on weather swings from hot to cold or from wet to dry and dry to wet. It's based on those things. Those things induce their flowering. But in the case of your plants, anytime we stay too far on one side of the scale for too long, it becomes stressful for them. If your soil is not biologically active, not only is it going to be stressful, but the plants are going to be susceptible to diseases. I think I've talked about tomatoes before. Tomato is one, and not just tomatoes, but many of the nightshade family. Many of them, when you're working with old soils and old compost, there's going to be viruses in there, there's going to be pathogens in there that are more than happy to splash up onto the lower leaves of your tomato plants and then make them sick because of the continuous moisture, the continuous wet conditions. So that's one of the reasons why I like to separate those two things. I like to separate old chips that are laden with all kinds of maybe even pathogenic substances. I like to layer them with fresh chips that I know have tannic acid, have simple fungus reducing chemistries in them, simple things that are going to introduce a different type of balance, not necessarily to the roots, but certainly to the moisture that splashes off of the chips and onto the bottom of the leaves. There'll be less of those pathogens, simply because I went ahead and put compost chips down in the late fall when weed pressure was low, and then I grew my plants in a media that isn't really difficult to grow in to begin with. Once my roots become established, as they are mostly here today, all those plants can handle me bringing in some fresh wood chips. The tiny little bit of elixir that drips down into them is going to help them more than hurt them. And I'm not going to inundate their fresh stems with fresh wood chips. Instead, I'll just keep them pared back just for a little while. All of this impacts the pH of the soil below. Generally speaking, anything that's been made up with wood chips and compost, after a period of time, it's going to seek neutrality. It's going to try to get to the point where it's close to 7. I've had it read 7 to 7.4, and that's a little bit too alkaline for my liking. My plants don't like it. They tend to grow in a little bit too yellow when the moisture and the pH is balanced in that range. So since moisture, temperature, and acidity and alkalinity impact where the pH sits on the scale, I try to make sure that each crop that goes in the ground has what it prefers already. That gives them an extra jump start. It allows me to seed and germinate much quicker. It allows, if I do plant some plant starts from one of the greenhouses, it allows them to go faster into growth stage. So we've all seen what transplant shock looks like. I can say one more thing. When I use my soil that I grow in as the media for my seed plants that are going to grow into my plant starts, there is very little transplant shock, because I'm going from like media to like media. I'm going from compatible soil to compatible soil. I'm not using something I bought from the store that was woefully cleansed of all of its living components, and then it was sitting on a shelf in a plastic bag under a mesh tarp over the top, and rain just inundated it with all kinds of bad mojo. That makes those soil packs sickly, and I don't use them. There's no reason to use them. With 4,000 square feet of gardening right in this one area here, I have plenty of soil to meet the needs of all of my new plants, and I'm sure many of you do as well. If your garden's been in place for 2 or 3 years, you've got a bank of broken down wood chips and compost below whatever the top covering is, and if that is harvested to utilize as a surrogate planting media, I promise you, your plant starts are going to do so much better. When we maintain continuity in all of the growth stages, the plants simply do better. When we work on watering routines that are consistent, moist, then drying, then moist, then drying, the plants are going to respond to that in a biological way that may surprise some of you. Now, from the standpoint of what we have going on now, you can probably tell this video is a little bit darker than the other modules that'll come after this, because in North Carolina, it's decided to rain a whole lot. And shooting these videos, I started out a couple of weeks ago, and it was really totally drought. And now, as I'm working on the videos and editing them and putting them together, it's gotten very, very wet. So I'm seeing the soil structure go in another direction that it was initially going in, and we're seeing a whole lot more vibrant growth. We are seeing some moisture stress because there's simply too much moisture. My response to that is going to be to continue to cover with new fresh ramial wood chips, because they will absorb a lot of that. They'll also do a better job at holding out more of the flooding rains we've been getting. So I'm aware of these things. We've become accustomed to laying fresh chips in the spring. It helps to keep the weeds out of play. It keeps them from germinating when they've blown in by the lawnmower, which is always going to happen. There's no way we're going to avoid that. It's a 2-acre field over there, and there's plenty of weed grasses and all kinds of things that are going to blow this way. In Piedmont of North Carolina, it's not a stranger to wind, and it's not a stranger to weird weather conditions. So all of that considered, in spite of all of that, I still maintain the same disciplined watering habits. It doesn't matter if I have to come out here with a watering bucket, which I've got right here, or the hose, or if I'm going to use my automated watering system to do the tasks for me. It makes no difference. I still check. I might check during drought conditions every day. It's not too much to ask. If you want your plants to be green, you want them to photosynthesize, they're going to need this extra push. If you overlook it and you're moving your plants all over the place from the house to the garden, the house to the garden, you're working on hardening them off, you're working on getting them ready to come in, still maintain good quality moisture controls, because the second they get in the ground, if the ground is moister than they are, they're going to recognize it. If the ground is drier than they're used to, they're going to recognize it. If the soils are different and they hold different capacities of nutrients, they're going to recognize it. If your soil is sanitized and completely dead, and then you put them in living soil, they're going to recognize that. Each one of these things has an impact on fertility and the growth of your plants. It certainly will be shown in the vigor when you keep the simplest, smoothest path towards getting a plant in the ground. That's what we like to do here, and basically that's what y'all should be doing there if and when you can. If you can't and other forces exist, we just work on eliminating each difficult situation one at a time, take it baby steps, rather than getting overwhelmed by so much insect pressure, watering problems, plant disease, herbicides. There's no end to it all. It's such a deep rabbit hole. You got to keep the faith. The provider has put these things in place for us, and when we learn to work within the guidelines that Mother Nature has set forward, we tend to do a whole lot better. We can also take a lot of pressure off of our shoulders, and there's no reason to beat ourselves up because we think we did something wrong. Everybody is just learning. Creedmoor's still learning. We're all in this together learning, and that's why I'm sharing. Because I've managed to squeak some pretty nice plants out of this pile of wood chips over the top of this dreaded, dead, toxicated red clay. Y'all don't hear me talk about it too much. I write about it all the time, but rarely do I discuss it. So what you're going to see here, the next couple of shots are going to be of me doing the tests, me zeroing in on the tests, me showing you what the moisture content of the soil is today. At the end, I'm going to show you how you can associate yourself with the different levels of moisture on the scale. Okay? What does green mean? What does green, moist soil feel like? I need to form an association with that so that I can quickly check moisture, just with my own brain as an analysis tool. So I'll go to an area that I suspect is probably a little bit drier, and I'll moisten it to this, and then what I'll do is I'll wait 5, maybe 10 minutes, and I'll go back and I'll check the scale to see that it's still in the same place at the depth I watered, and if it is, I'll reach down into that soil, pull some of it out, and I'll squeeze it. If it's dripping with water, we probably overwatered. Okay? But if it's not, it's just moist, and the moisture is moving through the soil the way it wants to, the way it's supposed to, you'd get a pretty good idea of what green means and why green is a good color to associate the right level of moisture content in your soils, because green is going to make your plants green. Okay? Enough said, on to the testing. So here we can see that the tester has been inserted about 1/3 of its entire length, and I'm sitting right on the edge of moist. It's important to note that the tester was cleaned thoroughly. I used Scotch-Brite to gently clean off any oxidation that might have formed on the aluminum or the copper. That allows it to do its resistance testing a little bit more accurately and give you the readings that you're looking for. This right now is showing that moisture is right on the edge of good, and if I insert it down to where I would like it to be in the good range, down at the 8-inch range, I want it to be good or a little bit wetter than good. So we'll go ahead and we'll push it down. I can see it's already pinning. I am at about 5 inches and it's already too moist. I would not water this area. I may not water it for 3 days. If I go all the way down even further, there's even more moisture banked in there. So this is a good indication that I don't need to water. But in periods of drought, it won't appear this way. In periods of drought, I'll be lucky to have the moisture up at the top, 2 or 3 inches. And with that being the case, it'll show moisture up at the top, it'll show in the good range, but when I push it down, the needle will start going towards the red side, which is dry. That being the case, I can push it all the way down, and by all the way down, I'm going to show you over here what that means. A good rule of thumb is to hold your soils down when you remove it. Just gently wipe off the probes. I can go over here. This is a safe distance. And I wish I could show you all this, but down here, there's a bunch of those artillery fungi, artillery mushrooms down here. It looks like they've already shot off. Glad that happened before I got here. But anyway, I'm pushing this all the way down, and that right there is just about too wet. So again, more confirmation that even the soils around the plants are holding good moisture. It rained last night, and I shut all the watering down around the whole farm, so nothing's getting automated watering. Now it's all Mother Nature doing her thing. And she waters so much more deeply than I do. So this would hold. But if it was 3 weeks ago, this needle right there would be far buried on the left side, and I would have to water. And believe it or not, you can do a lot of watering with a 2-gallon can. It doesn't take a whole lot of effort. This is gentle. It puts the water directly into the soils. I can't even demonstrate. Those of you who have used these, Grandma used to use them. They work really well. There's better ones out there. This is just a cheap one that I got to replace another cheap one that I had. I should probably get a better one, but we don't use it out here much. But it will work. It'll work for container gardening. This is just a giant container garden. That's all it is. And I would simply turn it, I'm not going to do it now, and water it until it came into range, and then I would stop. And that would be it. Tomorrow I'm going to come back out here. I'm going to look for the same probe holes with a clean probe and check it again. Am I showing drying, or is it getting wetter? Well, if it rains, there's no real reason to test. You know it's getting wetter. But if tomorrow's dry, I'd like to come out here and see how quickly my soil dries out. If I stay in the good range that I know I've got a 1 day, 2 day, maybe 3, it could even be a week's worth of buffer. So anyway, you got a pretty good idea about that. Now I'm going to take you over to another crop. Okay, so here we are in that lower section of my garden where I usually get better drainage and reduced water holding capacity at distances of about 8 inches. So in this particular area, I do like to grow crops that grow deeper on the whole because I think it complements them better. And what we got going here is bush beans. These bush beans, they normally do fine when we grow them down here. Every once in a while I grow them on the opposite side of the garden. They do really well over there. We've been working on this crop rotation thing lately to see how it works out, see how it complements us and what we do. But in any event, as far as moisture goes, I put the probe in. I've got 2 pictures showing what we're at right now with the probe all the way sat down deep into the soil at about 7 or 8 inches. We're showing pretty darn good for moisture holding. I have not watered this spot since 2 or 3 days ago, and I only did so just lightly to cool them off because it was really, really hot. We have been getting enough rain to make it so that I don't have to water so consistently right now, which is nice. Mother Nature's doing it for us. But early on in the growing season, and especially when these babies were really, really small and they were just seedlings, I was not practicing deep watering techniques. I was using shallow watering techniques to keep the moisture right up around those seeds, to keep those seeds just moist enough. I did not want to inundate them with water. I didn't want to take the chances of rendering those soils devoid of oxygen and making essentially just soupy mud. We really didn't have that problem because we were in the middle of a drought. So since we were in the middle of the drought, my watering by choice was somewhat conservative. I have some other concerns when watering in a drought, like running my well dry, and I never want to do that. But we were able to water sufficiently by just keeping the moisture in the top 2 inches of soil and keeping the seeds moist. Pretty much all of our beans germinated. Most all of them germinated, and they were able to progress right through into seedling stage and then the next plant stage, and now where they are now, they've already been in blossom stage and now they're in fruit stage. We got to this point by shallow watering, and once the rains came back, we've been relying on deep watering, and the difference being we are allowing the soils to dry out between watering, and I'm allowing them to dry out to a depth of about 6 inches. So once they get dry down to that point right there, I say, hey, let me go ahead and get them wet again, and I'll leave it be. Got some flies here today. The clouds are moving in. It looks like that rain, as promised, is going to be here shortly. So without further ado, I can say this. When you're practicing deep water techniques, you're trying to encourage the roots to grow down towards that moisture, way down below. If you don't water enough to have moisture down there, they won't have something to go after.
It's okay that it dries out on the top, provided you don't let the bottom dry out. If you let the bottom dry out, then they grew down there for nothing. So a plant that's just a seedling isn't reaching any of that soil, so it doesn't make sense to water way down there using 3 times as much water to get it really, really wet down there when the seed's not even germinated and the seed isn't even in it yet. Get your plants up and started first before you start giving them that deep water bath. And then once they're up and they're growing and you know you're certain that you're going to get some production out of that plant, then start to install the water to deeper depths. You can insert this tester and water a plant somewhat near its weep line, and you can literally watch the meter move up into the correct range. Once it reaches that correct range, you're done. I could water right here and satisfy the needs of both plants, moving up and again, so you can still definitely practice water conservation at the same time. Your intent is to deliver it to the right place, and then you won't be watering necessarily the next day or maybe even the day after that, because as long as this tells you the moisture's down there where the roots are, you don't have any reason to keep watering. So when you see at 8 inches or 7 inches it's starting to be bone dry, you're also going to see your plant start to yellow out. So those two things go kind of hand in hand with each other. And as you get in practice using a meter to scale and gauge how much moisture you need or you're holding in your soils, you'll get a better understanding of when the plants start to react to moisture stress. And moisture stress is one of those things you see a lot of people misdiagnosing other forms of disease, and it's really just moisture stress. So learning to keep the plant's roots moist isn't difficult, but it's really easy to get them soaking wet, and then all kinds of bad things happen. So one of the things that's allowed me to grow lush green plants, and I'll show you one other crop. We'll take a look at, let's see. We could take a look at my strawberries. The strawberries is a crop that we don't water a whole lot because it doesn't want to be soaking wet. It likes to have some moisture, but it doesn't want to have a lot of moisture. Too much moisture, especially down underneath the foliage cover, is going to encourage its fruit sets to start to mold up and rot. They become less desirable as a crop that way, and they're certainly no sweeter if they're covered in mold. So we don't overwater them, we don't deep water them. Their roots are somewhat shallow, so I don't really need to water them so deep. Plus, since it's a perennial crop, it's always here, the roots always exist. They like to be watered until they're satiated. They like to be watered when they're being fed, and in between flushes I will feed them. So if I get a whole bunch of blossoms and flowers and I get the pollinators coming in, soon after I get fruit. We harvest that fruit. When the plants no longer have the fruit, I'll go ahead and I'll feed them, and after I follow that feeding, I'll give them one good drenching of water so that I know that that feeding makes it into the soil, into the roots, and we won't water again. Soon after we'll get more flowers, the entire area will flower up, the bees will come back, and fruits will set once again. The ever-bearing strawberries do this. Y'all that have been following me know that I started this particular strawberry patch with just 3 plants that were kind of sickly and were being mishandled at one of the box stores. We took them home and they look like this. So here we have my strawberry patch. It's only a few years old. If y'all have the ability to zoom in on the video, you can see I've had some of my local farmers in here doing some pruning work for me. They hop in and they climb on the leaves and they chew them off because they're hungry and voracious. Little to know, Creedmoor's got a little something special for them called diatomaceous earth. I don't like to treat with the diatomaceous earth once I see the flowers because I know the bees are going to be busy in here. So the bees are going to have free reign, they're going to come in and do their thing, and I'm going to make sure that the plants have enough moisture to keep pushing new growth. Since the flowers have started, I have stopped feeding with fish emulsion. It's one quick feeding, and then a few days later the flowers come back. In this case here, it's taken about a week and a half or 2 weeks in between flushes, and now I'm starting to see the flowers, I'm starting to see the bees. If I could pan around, y'all would see that. I have the pictures of the tester indicating that we're right on the edge of okay. So this is one of those situations where I might give this particular crop a deep watering. I would make sure that I'm getting moisture down to the bottom of their roots. 6.5 to 7 inches is more than sufficient. Strawberry plants, they typically don't need to root very deep. They will if they can, but they don't have to all the time. And in the wood chips, they tend to just kind of hang out where the nutrients are. So in this case, I've had a good pruning by the by the local grasshoppers, and I've had a good pollination by the local bees. I can see one right over there doing his work, just beautiful as all get up. I love having them. This particular crop is about to get watered because, again, I hear the thunder in the distance, and I maintain this one this way. It's very simple. If I want a lot of strawberries, I got to make sure that I'm replacing what it takes to build a strawberry after it's made that strawberry. So I don't want this to dry out because strawberries are inherently moist and they need moisture to keep them that way, to keep them fruiting. If I could pan around the camera, you'd see in the canopy there's all kinds of red strawberries in there. But within about a week, there'll be fruit set and I'll have a whole entire other flush to pick off. So I'll be keeping my eye on this crop, hoping for the best. I'll be making sure that I don't get inundated with, you know, the bugs that like to eat my strawberries and like to chop off my blossoms. So today, the priority goes to the bees. They're in there right now working. I believe the bees could essentially satisfy the pollination needs of this size crop, which is about maybe 14 by 16 feet. I'm trying to limit it. It wants to grow all over the place. On the left side, we have the barrier of those sunflowers that you saw before, and on the right side, I have these rubber mats. But just above, I'm growing onions, I'm growing garlic, and I'm growing radishes up above. So they don't actually work for a great barrier up there, so these guys are trying to move towards the building. I'm fine with it for now. More strawberries is never a bad thing. But maintaining the moisture level appropriately is, because if I let this get too wet, all of this will rot. It will rot before I get a chance to benefit. The insects will come in, the plants will stress out, and they won't produce a good fruit in the first place. So we aren't supplemental watering this. There's really no reason to. If it doesn't rain, I might come out here in the morning and say, hey, it didn't rain. I'm going to go ahead and give you just a little bit of water. I'll pop the tester in the ground. I'll see what it is. I'll water it, and then I'll lay off because I know the intense heats are coming, and I don't want to leave a lot of moisture up at the top surface. So if I do, the sun will vaporize that moisture, and it will instantly damage the underside of these leaves, which we don't want that to happen. I'm not sure if y'all are familiar with that phenomena, but it does occur, and it can occur if you're watering on a day that's going to get intense solar radiation. I don't know if that's going to be tomorrow. I'll check the weather, but these are the things that you have to do. If you want to keep your crop strong and healthy, that's what you got to do. No crop comes without a little bit of stress. A little bit of stress is actually good for it. It's just whether or not it falls in or out of range of being able to be a productive crop or one that is just perpetually stressed out. And when you lay strawberries into a very, very wet area, they stay perpetually stressed out and they don't produce. But when you cycle from dry to moist and dry to moist, they do this thing where they grow all over the place, where they want to expand. They're constantly testing their limits to expand. They've grown over the top of my rubber border and into the lower plot. They're in the woods below me. The birds eat the berries. They're in my pond about 1,000 feet from here. They're growing over there. The strawberry knows no end. It's very reactive to changes in the environment, and by all rights it should be. It's one of our favorite fruits for sure. I'm sure y'all like them too. They don't just grow well here. I think they grow well in all sorts of areas, even up as far as maybe even New York, if I'm not mistaken. But know this, if you overwater them, they're going to stress. If you don't water them, they're going to turn yellow and they're going to stress. But if you keep an eye with the use of your tester, you'll get an idea of how long these periods are. You'll get an idea of what your influence is on them. And before you know it, you'll be watering only when they need it instead of all the time, just so you know it's wet. Never really a good practice, folks. Anyway, I hope some of this information is useful to you. I hope you get a better understanding of the difference between deep watering and shallow watering, and when we use deep watering and when we use shallow watering. In summary, we like to use shallow watering when we're starting seeds, and as they grow, we like to increase the amount of water and increase the amount of time between waterings. That allows the moisture to get deep into the soil, and then the plant chases it down as far as it can, as long as the soil is moist. It's growing roots. Hyphae is attaching to it. You're getting the benefits of the mycorrhizal rhizomes that are in the soil. All of the other things, that enhancements that you may have been putting in it for years, they're never going to get to be used if you saturate the water. They're never going to get to be used if it's too dry. So find that balance. Find that it's probably different in your garden than it is in my garden. Find that your crops are different than mine, and some crops like a lot of water and some crops like a little water. You've got to have that happy medium for all of them. It's not that difficult. If you make a mistake, my advice is put another seed in the ground. Drop another plant start. Pick another one if you're frustrated with that one and come back to it. A lot of people give up on things like squash because they build the garden and then instantly they grow a nice, seemingly healthy crop of squash, and sure enough the squash bugs show up and they destroy the crop. You could go through this loop where you're enhancing your soils with squash bugs that come back the next year because they're overwintering in your soils, and then you're growing the same exact crop the same exact way, using the same exact watering principles, same exact feeding principles, and then you're stuck with the same exact infestation. After time, Mother Nature will respond by sending you the enemy of the squash bug. That does happen, but a lot of frustration happens in the meantime, folks, and much of it can be avoided when we water the right way, when we enhance the soils the right way, and when we plant the strongest variety that we can get our hands on. In this particular case, if I could take the culture from these and grow them again, which I could do simply by clipping one of the rhizomes and planting it in a bucket and then taking it away, it would have the enhanced characteristics of this type of soil. Anyone else who had this type of soil would likely have the similar results. So just because you only have 2 or 3 plants this year doesn't mean that in 2 years you won't have an entire strawberry patch. Folks, just keep at it, keep an eye on your moisture levels, and all good things will come to an end. And at some point you'll have so many strawberries you won't know what to do with them. You'll be giving them to your neighbors and inviting people over to have strawberry lunch and smoothies with you. Hope you like it. Anyway, peace.